We're going to hear from a veteran of the Soviet war in Afghanistan who says the U.S. could be getting itself into a very dirty conflict. President Bush is already preparing the country for a war on terrorism. It may involve commando-style raids by special forces units.
But what would they be up against in Afghanistan? In tonight's 5 Reports, Barbara Rogers talked to a veteran of the Soviet military to find out.
There are
checkpoints that the army would establish.
The mountains of Afghanistan are now a world away from his adopted home in San Francisco. But Russian Army veteran Vladimir Bogat remembers the kind of fighting he did there, and an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere.
The elderly people and children can be your enemy. They can shake your hand, but they can shoot at your back 1 minute after.
As a member of an intelligence unit, Bogat says he participated in the kind of guerrilla tactics U.S. forces might have to use in Afghanistan. He says he won this medal for kidnapping a rebel leader.
Their group would just kidnap a lot of leaders.
But even using special forces, what are the chances the U.S. can locate and then reach Osama bin Laden, who's reportedly been hiding in caves in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan? No one knows for sure, but Soviet veterans do know the terrain.
Bogat says the Russian strategy was to seal the area off, then send in special units.
So each military unit would need to go into a specific cave, try to use weapons, but anything it takes.
Some refugees have claimed chemical weapons were used in the war. In published interviews this week, a former Russian general described specially built bombs designed to suck the oxygen out of mountain caves. Bogat wouldn't comment on specifics.
There was some equipment, specific equipment that we use, but he does not really want to talk about it, and he also knows that to use that equipment is forbidden internationally.
But he does have one piece of equipment left over that should give Americans an idea of how dirty guerrilla wars can be. The bullet on the chain was his personal bullet. He says none of his fellow soldiers was willing to be captured by that enemy. They would kill themselves first. For 5 Reports, I'm Barbara Rogers.
One other warning, Bogat said that surviving the Afghan terrain was a struggle in itself, with a barren, rocky landscape and very little water in some of the mountain areas.
And, you know, we've been reading Alexander the Great couldn't conquer that country. The Persians couldn't do it. The Brits, the
English,
Russians.
yeah.
That's right. All right, we're going to take a break. We're going to check in with weather and sports.
They've been grounded 3 times since the terrorist attacks, in part because the FBI says this man, Mohammed Atta, tried to purchase a crop duster in the weeks before he commandeered a 767 and crashed it into the world.
Is designed to financially starve Osama bin Laden and other terrorists. He said it's one of many steps in the United States battle plan to
learned from the last war in Afghanistan.
A Russian veteran offers advice on how American troops can smoke out Osama bin Laden.
For the first time in 12 years, Russian soldiers have returned to Afghanistan, this time in a humanitarian role. Now, the U.S. has apparently begun using military tactics developed by the Soviets during their Afghan war. We asked a veteran of the Soviet Special Forces to help us put those tactics in perspective.
Are you in this picture here?
Yeah. As a member of a Russian intelligence unit in the 1980s, Vladimir Bogat learned a lot about fighting in Afghanistan. First off, money talks.
Could the Afghan fighters be bought off?
Yes, of course.
He wasn't surprised to see so many Afghan fighters switch sides so quickly when the American-backed Northern Alliance began sweeping south. He says the Russians were able to buy critical expertise and information, including the services of informants who would guide them to enemy hideouts.
Usually, all of the operations would be organized the same way. It's first the Afghani reconnaissance group would be sent out, and then the Russians would follow them.
Bin Laden is apparently, we think he's holed up in some kind of cave near Jalalabad. Could we pay Afghan to go in and try to get him?
I think it is possible to do that, but you have to find the right channel.
And there is evidence that recruitment teams led by the CIA are already doing that. Until 2 weeks ago, the man driving this old Russian-made tank fought for the Taliban. Now he has rejoined the Mujahideen forces that he fought with 15 years ago. And he says he's willing to attack al-Qaeda positions. Just 40 miles south of his tank is the mountain fortress of Tora Bora, where the U.S. believes Osama bin Laden may be hiding. The soldiers claim American surveillance planes are monitoring the site, and there are unconfirmed reports that 2,000 Mujahideen fighters could be soon sent to the area, which contains deep bunkers and caves. That's a type of fighting that Vladimir is familiar with.
It is very hard to fight in those caves because it is very dark over there. The caves are very deep, and there is a lot of exits and entrances over there.
How did the Russians do it?
They would just blow up the exits and the entrances.
While it's unclear what advice or intelligence the former Soviet army might be contributing, for the first time since their withdrawal, a Russian medical brigade has returned to Afghanistan, setting up a humanitarian aid station in Kabul. Their presence is drawing curious onlookers who remember that war and even a bit of the language. Now, we asked Vladimir why he thought the Americans have had more military success in 2 months there than the Soviets did in 10 years. He said that the Soviet army was having success until the U.S. began supplying high-tech anti-aircraft weaponry to the Mujahideen. He says a key difference now is that nobody is directly helping the Taliban.
That's interesting. Now, Vladimir said they were switching sides back then. The Afghans would just switch sides very regularly. Are they still doing it as regularly today?
Absolutely. In fact, what's interesting is that they keep their weapons as they switch, as they leave the Taliban and join up with the Northern Alliance.
It's amazing.
Yeah.